Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to eastern Alaska, near the area around Glenallen and the junction of highways 1 and 4. The muskeg and lowland forest here are crowded with patches of fir, birch, and aspen trees with willow and alder along every shoreline. The moose here are plentiful, and predators of the area include wolves, black and brown bears. The undergrowth of this area is thick and provides a very dense screen for these predators to hide behind as they stalk moose or any other prey that catches their fancy. Hunting is still a way of life for many residents, but in prior decades it was even more integral to survival. Back in the 1950s, Lloyd Penny Pennington was doing what he loved, flying over the Alaska backcountry and checking out potential hunting areas. His favorite was to watch brown bears as they prepared to den up, as their behavior at that season was a tell as to where they would den for the winter. The bears would tend to lay near their desired denning spot for several days, seemingly waiting for the season to finally turn past the point where they would need to give into hibernation. As he scanned the scrub below, he found exactly what he was looking for on the hillside above Snowshoe Lake. The season did finally change long after Penny had returned home and began waiting out the long, cold winter at his lodge, a dozen or so miles east of Gunsight Mountain Lodge. It was located a few hours up the Glen Highway and offered easy access to the back country and pursuit of his passions, hunting and fishing. As the dark twilight of winter faded and the weeks wore on, springtime began to signal its arrival. In the lower elevations, the snow began to melt and leaves started to bud. This was Lloyd's sign that the bears hibernating in higher elevations would be leaving their dens soon. Lloyd contacted his close friend, Everett Kendall, his longtime barber and friend who had expressed a desire to bag a giant bruin before hanging up his hunting rifle for good. The two men lifted off in Lloyd's bush plane and were soon among the clouds and headed toward the hibernating behemoth. The mountains and trees passed by as if it were a giant piece of art. The lush spring greenery is broken by white patches of snow and ice. Deep blue lakes as pure as any water in the world sparkled below as the bush plane started to descend toward their planned destination. As the plane skidded to a stop on the patch of ice, the hunters began to focus on the task at hand. Lloyd immediately disconnected his seat belt and began digging through his gear to locate his rifle and binoculars. The two men disembarked the plane and briefly discussed their plan to bring the beautiful, powerful bruin home. As they hiked up the ice-patch trail, they kept a watchful eye on the hillside above them for any wildlife, both for the sights they may see, but also to avoid any dangerous confrontations. The trail climbed a few hundred feet, and the men started to feel their age and lack of physical fitness. They paused to glass the muskeg below them for any signs of life. After a few hours of slow progress, they arrived at the line of trees that marked where the bear was still denned up. Lloyd cautiously made his way to within a few yards of the opening of the den and noticed that the bear had already opened the snow at the entrance. This was a sign that Lloyd was all too familiar with, and he immediately understood that the bear would be emerging within just a few hours and be extremely hungry. The two men, weary from their hike, decide to go about 100 yards down the hill and enjoy a cigarette. As they made their way down the hill, they discussed the point from which they will plan to shoot the bear and the best way to recover the carcass. Lloyd found a small tree that was blown over, and the two men settled in for a smoke and small talk. They lit up their smokes and shared short stories about their life experiences and put their cigarettes out to get ready to get in place. As Kendall started to stand, he heard a loud roar and looked up to see the largest bear leaping toward him faster than he could process the predicament he and his friend were in. The saliva frothed from the deadly predator's mouth, and its 5-inch claws seemed to grow in size upon sight. Many people who have seen brown bears charging toward them indicate that it is mind-boggling to see such a massive creature moving through brush and broken terrain so quickly, and Kendall was no different. The elderly hunter tried to turn and run, but only got about 3 steps into his retreat when the enormous force of the impact of the bear's attack drove him face first into a hard, frozen snowbank. His rifle tumbled uselessly through the air and clattered onto the gravel bar several feet from the hapless hunter, now prey. The bear's giant canine teeth tore through the back of his skull and extinguished the light of his life in an instant. At that moment, Lloyd had just watched his longtime friend be killed before he could even click his safety off. The athletic and hungry bear turned from Kendall and glared at Lloyd for a split second before he turned and charged toward Lloyd. It wasn't enough for the bear that one man was killed, but that each threat it perceived be eliminated. Lloyd fired once, twice, 3 times, striking the bear in the foot but not hitting anything vital and unable to slow the murder-minded predator. The bear streaked toward Lloyd at incomprehensible speed. The powerful teeth crushed the hunter's arm first, and then the bear flung Lloyd to the ground. The Bruin pounced on the hunter with his front legs to hold him down as he tore and bit the man about the head and neck. The pain shot through Lloyd's body like lightning, and his consciousness faded, and he ceased the fight for his life. Lloyd's good friend Rick Houston started to get concerned when the hunters hadn't returned when they said they would, and decided to investigate to make sure they were okay. He boarded his bush plane and took off in the direction Lloyd had told him they would be hunting. A short while later, the pilot is searching the large area and witnesses the 2 hunters' bodies, still and motionless on the snowbank. He recognizes that the worst-case scenario has occurred, and heads back to gather men to bring this fatal encounter to an end and recover his friends. The search party returned to the airspace above the attack scene and tracked the bear over 30 miles by plane up the valley. When they finally located the bear at the end of the tracks in the snow, the bear stood defiantly on his hind legs and swatted at the distant bush plane menacingly. The search party landed nearby and immediately started to locate and eliminate the violent predator. As the men closed to a few hundred yards from the bear, he let out a roar that caused them all to briefly reconsider their mission. The brush started to erupt as if it was trying to get out of the bear's way on its own will. The giant Bruin, head low and full of rage, knocked down small trees and bush alike in its enraged pursuit of the men. Confusion reigned as the men moved for a good shooting lane in the thick brush. Shots began to ring out, one after another, and then more. Finally, the anger and hate in the bear's eyes faded as it fell only 20 feet from the closest search party member. The men skinned the bear and noted that this robust and healthy bear measured 8 feet from its nose to its tail once its skin was removed. Even with a lifetime of experience at hunting bears on their terms, every advantage the men had was not enough to save their lives, and now their friends labored to remove their bodies and give them the peaceful burial they deserved. After presenting the details of this case, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the bear was irritated by the presence of the people so close to his den, or the smoke from their cigarettes more? Why do you think the men sat down with their backs to the opening of the bear den? Do you think the bear knew there were humans in the bush plane when it stood and swatted at it? Do you support trophy hunting? Do you support subsistence hunting? I will love to read and answer your comments, so please post them below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode, The Frightening Case of J. Reeves, will take us to the bleak but beautiful Aleutian Island chains of Alaska, which extends toward Asia at its tip. It is a remote and rugged area wrought with potential dangers, but granting adventurers many rewards, including serenity, peace, and tranquility. The sharp fall wind shuddered the landscape. The alders, willows, and the tent shook, with the fury only Mother Nature could muster. As dark began to swallow the land, rain rhythmically tapped on the top of his tent, and the foreboding shadows stretched longer and longer. Frosty Creek was the location, and its landscape a bleak tundra-strewn frozen patch of isolation and solitude. This part of what drew the photographer to this spot. The Alaska Peninsula had many productive photography spots and very few people. Cold Bay was the nearest town, if it qualifies as a town at all. This was the opportunity every wildlife photographer dreams of. The rotting stench of dead salmon impugned the air as their carcasses littered the shores and sands of nearly every body of water in the area. All along the banks were bear daybeds, which the enormous bears used their giant claws to excavate, as efficiently as any piece of heavy machinery. Measuring about 8 feet in diameter, these daybeds offered telltale evidence of the size and power of the creatures occupying them, even in their absence. As 38-year-old Jay Reeves assessed the environs he would be filming in over the coming 7 days, he inventoried his food stores and snapped photos of bears and other wildlife surrounding him in his new neighborhood. A sense of joy and optimism filled him as he had finally realized his long-time goal of building his photo library with impressive brown bear stills and video. As Jay finished up his dinner, his mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with Robert Jones earlier in that day at Eisenbeck Ranger's office in Cold Bay. As Jay asked Robert for his best advice of finding giant bears to film and photograph, the ranger recommended Frosty Creek and offered a vital critique of the photographer's protective gear. Robert indicated that the .357 pistol Jay decided to bring was not an adequate firearm for bear protection, and consequently, Jay decided to leave it behind. Thoughts of this decision ran through his mind with reticence. It would probably be another safe and exciting adventure, he thought, in an attempt to calm his nerves. As Jay disrobed for the night and snuggled into his cozy sleeping bag, he began to wonder where he would start his photo adventure in the morning. His tent shuddered in the wind and rain, and slowly but surely he drifted off, warm and comfortable, and eager to begin as soon as he woke up. As the rain pattered, salmon slowly swam their way up the nearby creek. Not all of them were dead, but the few stragglers there were worse for wear. They were all near the end of their life cycle, culminating in their passing on of their genes to the next generation, and their corpses fertilizing the entire ecosystem, either as waste from animals who consumed them or as they rot and return to the soil. A large bear ambled up from the bank of Frosty Creek looking for anything that would increase his odds of making it through the coming 4 months of hibernation. In the distance, he smelled the scent of a man and the food he brought. He was a giant bear in the bear community. Whenever he encountered another bear, his immense size and dominant presence earned him his preferred fishing locations, and it usually took a few grunts and jaw pops to run the competition off. As the giant strolled closer to investigate the tent flapping in the wind, the smell of food grew stronger, and his survival urges drove him forward. Jay sat up quickly, stirred from his dream of a bear by grunting and jaw pops right outside of his tent. He could see the tent bow inward as the bear pressed his nose against it. Fear overwhelmed him as he knew this was not just a curious cub, but a potentially violent and hungry predator. As fear swallowed up reason, Jay quickly slid from his sleeping bag and decided to run from his tent and leave his food stores to distract the hungry bear. As the 600-pound bear collapsed the tent, Jay managed to slip through the door. Jesse Owens would have been left in the dust as Jay ran faster than he'd ever thought he could. Just as he thought the bear had been distracted with the food in the tent, he heard a ground-shaking roar. As he anxiously glanced over his shoulder, Jay saw the most frightening thing he could imagine. The hungry bear had swiveled his attention to the fleeing human and already started to take his first leaping bounds toward Jay. His heart sank at the memory of seeing grizzlies flowing across the most difficult terrain flooded his mind. Jay knew that the bear would be on him before he could find any safety. With a single swat of his 8.5-inch wide paw, the young grizzly, in his prime, knocked Jay down and straddled him nearly without resistance. The agility and power of the grizzly was too much for the outmatched photographer as his life ebbed and flowed, his energy and flesh prepared to make the final stretch of the great cycle, from dust you've come, and to dust you shall return. After the man's flame of life was extinguished, the hungry bear took hold of his leg and dragged him into the alders for the privacy of a meal alone. The bear fed on Jay's body through the night and only left his prize to rummage through the remnants of Jay's camp and to destroy anything there that riled his angst. The following day, Frank Snodgrass drove up to the camp and witnessed the flattened tent and chaotic campsite. He noticed no human presence and immediately reported the scene to the local Fish and Wildlife Service. John Sarvis and John Stimpson climbed aboard the helicopter filled with anxiety and concern for Jay Reeves' safety. They decided to fly up the Frosty Creek watershed to try to find him. As they approached his campsite, they could see no sign of human activity, with only canned food and clothes littering a slight trail toward a clump of nearby alders. Stimpson landed the craft, and Sarvis began to search afoot. As the helicopter lifted off the ground and made an initial pass of the area, the bear leapt from the alders in rage and hid again in the undergrowth. Sarvis was picked up, and the two searchers looked for the bear from the air. This time they noticed some blue clothing and a patch of ground all torn up. As they hovered, they observed the dead man's skull on the mound of torn-up soil. Deciding to focus on stopping this man-eater for once and for all, Sarvis grabbed a .30-06 hunting rifle from the back of the copter and and dropped the massive grizzly with a single shot. The men quickly landed and cautiously approached the now motionless Bruin. As a matter of investigative procedure, Sarvis began to dissect the bear. As he examined the stomach contents of the bear, human bone fragments, skin, tissue, and muscle from J. Reeves were removed. The next day, the recovery team returned to bring Mr. Reeves back from the mountains and give him a good Christian burial. After locating his remains, they were only able to find his pelvis, some ribs, and his head. The bear had consumed the rest of J. Reeves. His possessions were rounded up and loaded unceremoniously into the helicopter to be returned to his loved ones. State biologists would later say that J. Reeves made two major mistakes in his adventure. His first was keeping his food in his tent with him, and his last was making camp on a...
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Stickeen River, which traverses the Canada-Alaska border over its nearly 150-mile length. The mouth of the river opens up to the city of Wrangell, Alaska, and its headwaters begin in northwest Canada. The terrain is extremely rugged and steep. The forest and undergrowth in this area is very thick and is considered a temperate rainforest. It receives about 80 inches of rainfall per year, but that amount is less than the rest of southeast Alaska. In the drier months of the summer, temperature generally stays in the 60s, but winter comes quick and early around late October. It is in this beautiful and wild setting that our story takes place today. On Sunday, October 6, 1940, 5 men were fishing near Paradise Camp, 27 miles up trail on the Stickeen River, Alaska. The men had a productive day of fishing and were getting packed up to head back to the cabin they were staying in. One of the men, Grover Foster, had left ahead of the others and followed the trail they came in on. The next man to leave was Frank Barnes, and instead of following the trail with the other men, he decided to take a more primitive shortcut by himself. He picked up his supplies and the shotgun he carried for protection and started pushing his way through the bush-crowded trail. The group quickly lost sight of him in the dense ground cover and continued to pack up their fishing equipment. It was only a few minutes before the men heard a gunshot from Frank's shotgun. They heard him yelling and began making their way through the dense brush toward him. After several minutes of bushwhacking, they stumbled upon him. He was a mess. He had apparently run into a bear and was savaged. He had severe wounds all over his body and was stuffed between two medium-standing willow bushes. The ground cover was so thick, and he was wedged so firmly into the spot that his friends began removing willow branches and limbs in their effort to free him. They finally got him out and packed him back to the river and loaded him on the boat. The men piloted the boat downriver to Wrangell and the medical facility there. Frank was treated and loaded onto another boat to be taken to a bigger medical facility in Portland, Oregon. Frank died from his injuries during that process. Around a year later and about 30 miles downriver, father and son Tim and Arnold Prussy were piloting their boat up the Stickeen River with plans to scout for a moose hunt that was coming up soon. The two men found a promising spot for fishing and pulled over for lunch and maybe a little bit of scouting too. The son, Arnold, had recently won a .30-06 rifle in a raffle and brought it on the trip with plans to sight it in on the way. After some productive fishing, Arnold decided he needed a good stick to poke into the riverbank to hold his fish. He loaded his rifle and carried it with him as he searched. Arnold had walked about 30 yards away to a nearby bush and began cutting himself a stick when he noticed a large brown bear emerge from the brush a short distance away. The bear wasn't looking at him and seemed to be focused on his father, Tim. The bear was slowly creeping along the riverbank, approaching his father from behind. The bear sniffed the air and moved its head continually, trying to get a good look at Tim and his surroundings. As Arnold watched, the bear lowered itself to a point that its belly nearly dragged on the ground. It looked as if it were crawling closer to the oblivious fisherman. It carefully closed the distance and slowed its movements. The bear was about 25 yards from Tim at this point. It then pulled its rear legs underneath it as if it were getting ready to launch an attack. Arnold had seen what he needed to see to decide to shoot the bear before it attacked his dad. He aimed his loaded rifle at the bear and fired, but missed. He quickly worked the action of his rifle to load another shell and aimed again. The report of the rifle rang through the valley and the bear collapsed to the ground. The shot had struck her through her spine and paralyzed her rear legs. She roared loudly and tried to continue the attack using only her front legs, pawing the gravel to gain traction. Arnold chambered another round and finished the bear off with a solid hit to the neck. She lay motionless and prostrated before him on the river shore. Tim was shaken by the shots and had no idea what all the ruckus was about. He ran over to Arnold and the two men talked in amazement at how close the bear was. The men slowly started walking toward the Bruin. They were cautious because they were aware of the intelligence and trickery these bears were known for. As they got closer to the bear, they could see the bear was horribly disfigured. Her snout and jaw were essentially separated at the end. Where the bear's snout should have been was missing, and her canine teeth protruded like fangs on a snake. The men wondered if this was due to another bear, or had this bear been shot by hunters, poachers, or someone defending themselves. Could this bear have lived an entire year, including the winter, with this degree of damage to her mouth? Was this shotgun wound from Frank Barnes? Post your thoughts in the comments and tell me what you think. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Nalchine Public Use Area northwest of Anchorage, Alaska. This part of the state consists of steep mountains covered in fir and pine stands and forests, as well as birch trees, alder, and willow bushes crowding the valley floors. There are hillsides that are covered with shorter bushes as well, but most of the area is forest. The animals here are the typical Alaska fauna, including moose, brown and black bear, as well as an abundance of fur bearers and birds. I was hunting moose in a huge tract of land dedicated to allow people to enjoy the woods. In Alaska, hunters are allowed to hunt moose for sustenance, that is, for food. The requirements to harvest are that the moose must be a bull of a specific size or larger. I had been hunting in my secret spot for about 8 years. It had been a reliable place to find bull moose that met sustenance hunting minimum size requirements for each of the last 8 years. This is no small feat in moose hunting, and this place is what hunters call a honey hole. That means that it is a sweet spot to harvest the target animals. In the fall of 2011, I was doing my normal yearly preparation before heading to my honey hole by float plane. I took careful inventory of my necessities and tracked their weight, as I would only have 180 pounds of cargo load to carry on my de Havilland Beaver before passing the weight limit. I grabbed the usual equipment, my tent, sleeping bag, guns, ammo, and distinctly recall carefully examining my moose call and being excited about how much meat it had helped me put in the freezer. The next morning I arrived at the small private airport and eagerly walked toward my small plane in the dark. My gear was already loaded the prior day, and all I had to do was buckle up and prepare for takeoff. I cranked the engine after completing my pre-flight review and then taxied down the short runway. As I gained speed and approached the end of the runway, my de Havilland Beaver lifted off gracefully, and away I went. I flew for a little under an hour and saw the Talkeetna River come into view. In stretches of the river is a steep canyon, which can make for very frightening and riveting wind patterns at times. I followed the river to the point at which it turns west, and I went east, gently landing in remote Steffen Lake. The lake is surrounded by a mix of tundra, bush, and small patches of Sitka spruce. Now, Sitka spruce are a particular species of spruce tree which are adapted to the Arctic and subarctic climates, and grow in muskeg areas, and don't usually pass about 5 to 7 feet in height. This area offered tremendous views to observe for my moose. As I unpacked my float plane and tethered it to the shore, I paused to take in the cool October air and the freedom and loneliness that Steffen Lake always gave me. It centered me in many ways and helped me keep perspective on life when I visited. I set up my tent and laid out my bed and sleeping bag and prepared my dinner. After eating dinner and briefly reading my Bible, I decided to get to bed. I was too excited to go to sleep right away and tentatively planned out my hunt for the next day. Uneventfully, consciousness faded and I fell asleep. My alarm startled me awake at 7:30 a.m. It was cold outside in my sleeping bag, and I hurriedly got dressed and put on my stocking cap. I warmed up some oatmeal and sipped my coffee quickly so I could get on the trail as quickly as possible. Then I remembered it wouldn't even get light for another hour. I decided to take advantage of having the time to start hiking toward the meadow that had often been bull moose and many other game animals there in the past. Utilizing my headlamp to light my way, I stumbled and huffed my way along the trail for about an hour and arrived just as the sun peeked over the horizon and light revealed the features of the land. I positioned myself on the high end of the slope so I could see the entire area and relaxed behind my spotting scope. Every hour or so, I would let out a long, low, pitched moan, mimicking a cow moose in heat and looking for a mate. Alternately, I would let out a grunt like wah to mimic a lovesick bull moose in pursuit of a cow. As the day passed, I saw a handful of smaller animals, but none of the usual caribou, nor any moose. It was perplexing, as in the past I had seen at least 10 caribou on any given day, and an assortment of sheep or goats as well as moose, but not this day. The next day I hiked to a different site and essentially repeated the same pattern, and this went on for 3 days. Nothing. I couldn't believe it. On the 6th and final day of my moose hunt, I decided to go down closer to the river. It was a longer hike, but due to the absence of any game near my camp, and going home with no meat was not an option, I decided it was worth it.
Again I sought and found a promising stand of willows and alders and began calling. I would wait a few hours in one spot and then move about a mile and repeat the process. Nothing. Finally I found a flatter area and positioned myself comfortably. I let out several cow calls and a few bull calls. Then I heard it. Not too far away either. Finally, I said to myself. I gathered my things and slowly stalked toward the grunt that answered my grunt. I would grunt, and the other bull would grunt in reply. About every 5 minutes we would exchange grunts, as if we were getting a good idea of where each other were located. I noticed I was moving toward that bull, but he didn't seem to be moving toward me. This is not exactly common, but he was apparently not very confident in his fighting skills. I moved my way through the alders and up over a hill, and heard a grunt and returned to my latest grunt. As I looked down the hill, I could see a medium-sized muskeg patch, which is an Arctic swampy area. In the middle of the muskeg was a stand of short, black Sitka spruce that was probably no taller than about 5 feet toward the middle of the patch, then was shorter toward the edges. The grunt was coming from those Sitka spruce. Using the higher viewing position I had, I set up my observation post and returned a challenge grunt to the lovesick bull. He answered. Then I answered him. He returned the challenge, but did not show himself. This went on for the next hour, neither of us moving, but continuing to challenge each other. Then a spike moose appeared on the far side of the muskeg and lifted his nose into the air. Suddenly he turned tail and ran back through the alders and willows the same way he came. I figured he must have winded me after 6 days of hiking in the bush. But why didn't the bull in the Sitka wind me? After another hour of the same grunt exchanging, my patience was worn out and my daylight was just about spent. I decided to stop grunting to see what the bull would do. I waited 10 minutes. Then 20 minutes passed. He grunted every once in a while, but I would not answer. Another 15 minutes goes by, and I remain silent. After another 10 minutes or so, apparently the silence got the best of him, and he had to start investigating where the other bull I was pretending to be had gone. I could see the Sitka start to shake and move as the bull started to emerge. As I stared at the point he would seemingly emerge from, I was suddenly very confused. I saw this giant round face poke out of the Sitkas. Suddenly this giant round face raised up to reveal a gigantic brown bear. The Sitka spruce that surrounded him barely reached the middle of his chest as he stood on his hind legs. According to this comparison, I guessed his height on his hind legs to be at least 10 feet tall. That is when it all came together in my mind. The reason I had not seen even a single animal in the honey hole. The reason he wouldn't move toward me. The reason the small bull on the other side of the muskeg wouldn't come to me. This bear had figured out how to grunt like a bull moose and had grunted his way into wiping out my honey hole of almost all the once plentiful moose. He was using the location of the Sitka spruce stand to conceal himself as the oblivious moose would trudge across the muskeg to him, revealing their approach and slowing their escape. This bear was what we call a 10-square bear. In hunting terminology, that means that once you harvest him and remove his hide, it would measure 10 feet from front paw to front paw and then 10 feet from nose to tail. The part that really frightens me is that this bear had somehow learned to mimic the mating grunt of a bull moose in rut and devise an ambush strategy that would allow him to see and hear them before they approached him and would limit how quickly they could escape from him. A predator this intelligent, thoughtful, and meticulous haunts my nightmares. And now I rarely stay in the woods overnight, especially unarmed.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Canadian province of Alberta. A couple 100 kilometers northwest of the big city of Edmonton lays prime Crown land, which is owned by the British royal family. This land is rugged and is a thick arboreal forest. The trees here are Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and lodgepole pine. The ordinary bushes of the area are trailing raspberry, mountain laurel, white-flowered rhododendron, and tall bilberry. Animals you might see in this area include elk, deer, wood bison, and moose. The predominant predators of this area range in size from the swift fox to the lynx and all the way up to wolves as well as black and brown bears. It is in this remote and rugged setting in which our episode today takes place. Harvesting timber anywhere in Canada is a process that comes with its own amount of red tape and requirements. Private land logging is easier, but pulling timber from Crownland places certain requirements on lumber companies, and one of those is to replant the ground with pine and fir saplings after harvesting timber. This practice is a nod to sustainability and helps forests recover for harvest again at the maturation of restored forest lands. In ecology, there is a concept known as succession. Whenever there is a forest fire or landslide that sterilizes or removes layers of topsoil deposited over decades, a new series of plants and animals moves in to eventually return it to forest. In a slide area, the first to return are plants like lichens and mosses. After they prepare or replace missing soil, plants like grasses and small bushes will grow with their corresponding animals like rabbits, hares, foxes, and birds of prey living there. After that, larger bushes and smaller trees, and culminating over about 60 years, the large mature forest will be restored. Upon the return of the mature forest, complete ecosystems are built by the return of larger animals like moose, deer, elk, and bears. This cycle of succession is continually in process in various pockets all around the world and is dependent upon the series of plants and animals depositing minerals and organic compounds that will allow future succession to develop. The requirement to replant harvest timberlands shortcuts the succession process by decades, as saplings are immediately planted instead of waiting for Mother Nature to distribute the seeds for future trees by fire, wind, animals, and weather. On Saturday, July 31st, 2021, a 26-year-old employee of the timber contractor had flown in to bring in some pine and fir sapling planters. To respect her and her family's privacy, we will call her Jane. After landing in the helicopter, everyone disembarked from the craft carrying backpacks and personal items. They were ready to walk for miles, bending over to tuck small saplings into openings they made in the ground with their tools and taking a few steps to repeat the process. This occupation allowed them time in the wilderness and gave them an opportunity to do something that felt meaningful to them, restoring the forests after humans utilized the resources. Not only is this work difficult, it is met with its own perils. The land is frequently devoid of significant trees, and the animal life used to forest now finds wide open areas which may change their opportunities for food and shelter. Encounters with cougars, wolves, and bears are not uncommon in this line of work, but are rarely serious in nature. They grow accustomed to how to handle the sudden appearance of a top-tier predator and usually de-escalate any encounter before either party is injured or killed. Jane was a helicopter engineer, which gave her the role of repairing and replacing worn-out parts of the timber company's helicopters. She was essentially a helicopter mechanic, but on this day was out helping replant the trees in the latest timber harvesting area. As Jane was stooping and planting the pine and fir saplings with the rest of the tree planters, she had no way of knowing there was a female black bear near her. She was apparently busy focusing on spacing out the saplings she was planting and enjoying the freedom of such a remote location. The saplings are placed about 6 feet apart from each other to minimize disease and maximize the sapling's chances to thrive. It will have to compete less this way than it would if it were crowded with other saplings. During the months of July and August, black bears in northwest Alberta have a broad palette of berries to choose from for consumption. These berries include crowberries, bearberries, buffalo berries, and even juniper berries. The bears follow the berry seasons as they emerge at different elevations while feeding on sedges, rushes, and grasses near marshy areas. Another summer staple for bears is ants. Given that each of these food items is available based on weather patterns and environmental factors, bears are constantly moving to follow food sources as they arrive in season. This weaves a certain degree of predictable unpredictability to the location and behavior of bears. As Jane worked her way around a nearly barren hillside with her cohorts, a black bear emerged from a patch of bushes. The bear didn't hesitate as it tackled Jane to the ground and began clawing and biting her in a sudden and violent attack. Her fellow tree planters heard Jane's call for help and came running to see a large black bear standing over her, still biting and clawing at her. One of her cohorts, whom we will call Mike, ran over and began yelling at the bear. He was trying to drive it off of Jane and stop the attack on her. After a little less than a minute of yelling and throwing large sticks at the bear, the animal finally departed the scene and headed for cover once again. Mike approached Jane's side and tried to help her by administering first aid and comforting her. The tree planters gathered Jane up and carried her back to the helicopter. They loaded her inside and started the engines to get her to medical help as soon as possible. The helicopter was flown back to Swan Hills Airport, and medical teams were waiting on the tarmac to begin working on Jane as soon as the helicopter set down. Jane was bleeding and torn from the bear attack. No matter how much they tried, her life was slipping away. Jane was pronounced dead there at the airport before she could be taken to the hospital for life-saving measures. As word of Jane's passing made the news circuit, the Alberta Fish and Wildlife went to work. They gathered trail cameras and foothold snares and deployed them around the area of the attack. They also pulled Jane's DNA for analysis and comparison with any DNA evidence on any bears they may snare. Their efforts went well rewarded as they located 3 black bears in the vicinity of the attack soon afterward. After snaring the bears, the paws and claws of the animals were swabbed for remnant DNA, like blood or other fluids that may have been shed on them during the attack. An adult female with no cubs turned out to have DNA evidence on her body, and that DNA evidence matched Jane's DNA. The animal was euthanized to prevent it from injuring or killing additional humans. Jane was only the 2nd tree planter who has been killed in Canada, but was the 6th black bear attack fatality in Alberta since 1958. The statistics show a seasonal uptick in bear attacks, peaking over the months of May, June, July, and August. Experts relate this peak in attack frequency to the presence of more unarmed people exploring the forests during these months. Given the circumstance of this attack, let's analyze a few variables involved in it. The authorities labeled this attack as a defensive attack, but the area was free of significant portions of its large trees, making an approaching bear more easily seen, as well as any approaching humans, so the likelihood of Jane and the bear surprising each other is reduced. The sow didn't have cubs, and was not reported to be diseased, nor defending a food cache anywhere near where Jane was fatally mauled. The area around the attack was being walked by tree planters, so it is possible that the bear was trying to escape but felt cut off by humans each way she turned. The bear may have been frustrated and attacked Jane out of not seeing any other way to escape. Do you think the attack on Jane was predatory or defensive? Why didn't Jane and the others have firearms or bear spray to protect themselves, especially given their location? With the absence of the typical contributing factors, being the presence of cubs or a food cache, why do you think the bear attacked Jane with such violence? I would think if it were a defensive attack, it wouldn't have lasted long enough to end her life. Do you think the open terrain allowed the bear to close on her upon seeing her from a distance in a predatory manner? This episode is confusing in some ways, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the wild northern Rockies near Calgary, Alberta, Canada. The granite mountains rise over a mile high from the valley floor, which is around a mile high itself. The mountains here form a geographic barrier that runs from north to south and are socked in by fog and snow for much of the year. As you can imagine, the valleys between the mountains are lush and green, crowded with a ground-level canopy of alder, berry bushes, and wildflowers like yellow glacier lily and fireweed. Pine and fir trees compose the upper canopy in the forests and provide shade and shelter from the wind. The animals of the area are black and brown bears, elk, moose, deer, cougar, and wolves. Fur bears and common forest rodents like squirrels and chipmunks round out the typical Rocky Mountain cast. In the evening time of May 4th, 2021, esteemed Associate Professor of Environmental Management and Sustained Development at the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business, 59-year-old David Lertzman, headed out for his second of 2 daily runs. He decided that he would run up Moss Trail just above town today. David taught graduate and undergraduate classes on leadership as well as sustainable development with Indigenous peoples. He also directed wilderness retreat classes in the nearby area of Kananaskis. David headed up the trail, which has its rolling aspects, then climbs to a beautiful view. Passing by such scenery while running increases the hormones that relax your body and improve mental peace. It's an excellent way to exercise in such wild and natural surroundings. As David trotted along the trail, unbeknownst to him, he was not alone. A sow grizzly bear and her cub were near the trail he was jogging on and hiding just out of David's field of vision. Springtime is a dangerous time to encounter a sow and a first-year cub due to the aggressively protective traits bears are known for, and this incident was about to take a very scary turn. As David jogged past the sow and her cub, her protective instincts kicked in and she charged. David had no idea she was closing in on him from behind and was admiring the view from the top of the high escarpment he was climbing up. David left around 6 p.m. for his jog, and by 10 p.m. his wife Sarah decided to go out and look for him herself. She drove to the area and began walking up the trail. As she approached this steep area of the trail, she looked up the hill and over the sides for evidence of where her husband could be. She was expecting he might have injured himself and was unable to come back down the trail. She was hoping to find him and help him back home to take care of him. She found no evidence of what occurred. After being notified, the authorities gathered a search party and sent out a helicopter with a spotlight and search equipment. They combed the trails and valleys in the area for a short while before they located him. His body lay crumpled alongside the creek at the bottom of the ravine and was discovered at 2 a.m. He was recovered and taken to the coroner's office for examination. The coroner's report would reveal one of the most intriguing and perplexing bear attacks in the recorded history of bear attacks. After reviewing the injuries on David's body, the authorities concluded that his 900-foot fall down the steep embankment was preceded by a bear attack. Apparently, the sow bear overtook David as he jogged up the trail on the steep slope and shoved him, causing him to tumble down the cliff to his death. They used track evidence on the trail as well as other physical evidence to discern this. They also indicated that the attack was not predatory and that the cub was not involved. Sarah had spent a few hours in the area and didn't notice any bear sign or reason for alarm while traveling her husband's route. She actually stood at the exact location of the attack but saw nothing noteworthy or concerning in the area. Authorities were quick to point out that she could very easily have suffered the same or a similar fate as her husband. Upon learning of David's death, Sarah indicated that she could feel him transitioning into the spiritual realm and that the bear did so as well. She felt as if they were wrapped around each other, spiritually intertwined in this terrible incident. She pointed out that David died very near his 60th birthday, which seemed fitting to her. I'm not sure what all that spiritual aspects of her sentiments mean, but it's clear David meant a lot to a lot of people. This set off a 3-week period of game officers setting traps and baits out in the area to try to locate the bear for examination and to understand why this tragic event occurred. They placed culvert traps in a few places and watched for bear activity in the area. After the 3 weeks passed, they concluded that the sow and cub had moved on and were no longer in the area. They removed the traps and scaled back their operation to find her. They also reopened the trail system to the public, deeming it safe for humans again. The community mourned David's passing at a memorial. He was eulogized as a beautiful and unique, marvelous human being, and someone who changed people's lives each time he taught a class. David lives on, as the work he began by developing inroads with indigenous people groups in the area is championed by University of Calgary's indigenous strategy called I'itapo, which aims to help businesses heal the wounds of the past. In the summer of 2021, there were 3 fatal bear attacks in the province of Alberta. 2 of the attacks were only 40 kilometers apart, begging the question, could this same bear be responsible for more than one attack? Is the cause for such a large increase in bear attacks and human fatalities due to human presence in bear territory, or is there more to it? Do you think the cub will apply what it saw during the attack and have a higher chance of human attack?
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a state in the United States that has long been the center of controversy around proper management of bear populations. This location is the state of New Jersey, and specifically mountainous Essex County. The elevation here is very low at under 700 feet, and the forests are extremely thick due to the humid subtropical climate. It is the 14th most densely populated county in the USA and the 2nd most densely populated county in New Jersey. It has an average of 13,731 people per square mile. That's a lot of people, but the density of black bears is much more concerning. Black bears here have a veritable smorgasbord of berries, fruits, nuts, insects, bird eggs, and animals to feed from. As soon as they emerge from their winter dens, they feast on skunk cabbage, forbs, bulbs, tubers, and insects. There are so many deer here that many are killed by cars, creating a carrion buffet around nearly every corner of the road. Area residents have developed a practice of taking their trash to the curb in the morning before heading to work, instead of leaving it out overnight. This pattern was established after so many of them left their trash out at night and woke to find their own garbage scattered down the street. Putting the trash out at daybreak just before the garbage truck comes by doesn't always keep the bears out of the trash, but it does help. Around 7 a.m. on January 7th, 2022, 81-year-old Carol Nabor was taking her trash to the curb for pickup. She was a manager with AIG in her professional life, but had retired since then and enjoyed a slower time with her dogs. She had 5 grandchildren whom she also spent time with, but their visits were intermittent. For fun, she worked at a local animal shelter and rescued orphaned cats just because she loved animals. The year prior, she had to have her 17-year-old Springer Spaniel put down, and now only had the dog's pup, 14-year-old Amanda, left. Carol's neighborhood was flanked by a thick covering of woods that ran all the way up to her property line. Carol flicked on the outside lights and opened the door for her Springer Spaniel, Amanda, to come with her. Along with Amanda was Carol's daughter's dog, a Vizsla. The 2 dogs streaked past her with a lot more energy than usual. They were barking and growling as soon as they got out of the door. Carol looked up as she closed the door behind her and could see 2 very large black bears across the road from her house, eating from her neighbor's trash bins. This wasn't anything abnormal, as there are bears everywhere in this part of New Jersey, and raiding the trash bins is their favorite thing to do. The dogs ran up barking and growling at the bears. The larger bear immediately dashed for the safety of the woods, but the smaller bear bowed its back at the dogs. Its ears were pinned back, and the hair on its neck stood up to make it look larger. As they got closer, the bear swayed its head left and right a few times in obvious irritation. Carol wasn't too alarmed at the racket the dogs were raising, but then the situation took a more serious turn. Her dog, Amanda, didn't slow down as she approached the bear. Amanda ran right up to the bear, in fact, and growled as a show of protection for her owner. Apparently, the protective pup thought the bear had its eye on Carol, and that was something Amanda wouldn't tolerate. Amanda made one very serious mistake in her owner's defense. She got within swiping distance of the bear's paws, and one swipe sent her flying. As the dog tumbled a few times, the bear wasted no time and was on her before she could regain her feet. The angry Bruin pinned Amanda to the ground and tried to get a hold of her with its jaws. Amanda nipped and spun in an attempt to keep the bear on its heels. As Carol watched the fracas, she briskly walked toward the bear. She yelled out, calling for Amanda to come back, but the dog was clearly distracted by the bear. About the time Amanda began yelping, Carol was only a couple of feet from the pair. As soon as Carol heard Amanda yelping, her protective mama bear came out. She started punching the bear in the head. At first, the bear didn't pay her any mind, but after a few blows from Carol, things changed. It was almost like the bear suddenly became aware of her presence after several of her tiny fists landed. It turned its head in her direction and away from Amanda. This is all Carol wanted, to have the bear release her dog and let the bear go on its way. But the bear was defending itself from 2 dogs first, and now an angry octogenarian. The big bear swung its head toward Carol and locked its jaws on her lower leg, causing her to tumble onto her back. Now, in a vulnerable position, Carol knew she was at the bear's mercy. Its teeth gashed her leg, and now it seemed it may be set on doing more than that to her. Upon seeing Carol tumble onto her back, the bear focused its attention back on Amanda. It pinned her to the ground with its paws and pushed its muzzle into her body as far as it could and closed its powerful jaws. It picked Amanda up into the air a few feet and bounded into the woods with the dog yelping in pain and flailing about. By now, neighbors and friends had begun to converge on the scene. Carol was regaining her feet and explained that the bear had run off with her dog. Police responded to the scene and immediately began to search for the dog in hopes that the bear had lost interest and left her alone in the woods nearby. A short distance into the woods, the searchers found Amanda. She suffered from very serious bites to her body and was in terrible shape. The police officers scooped her up and immediately headed to a nearby veterinarian for life-saving treatment. Amanda's wounds were so grievous that her life slipped away before any medical intervention could save her. Carol received a few stitches to close the gash on her lower leg caused by the bear's bite. A search was initiated to locate the dog-killing bear, but all efforts turned up fruitless. Authorities parked a large culvert trap in Carol's driveway, trying to catch the marauding bear before it could kill another dog or endanger another person. They decided that if they located the bear, they would need to kill it for fear it might continue to cause problems for the neighborhood. Authorities estimated that the bear was nearly 400 pounds, but I could find no source indicating that it was ever caught or killed. Regarding the bear attack on her and her dog, Carol stated that she survived because of Amanda's brave sacrifice. She says that if the bear hadn't snatched Amanda, the bear may have killed her. She states that it is hard losing both of her dogs in the same year and misses Amanda every day. The New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection has noted that black bear populations are appearing to move into residential areas and are spotted more there than in the wild. Incidents involving black bears increased from 372 in 2021 to 804 in 2022. That is an increase of 116% in a single year. New Jersey hunters and their advocates have laid out the case that bear hunting is needed to thin populations out, especially near residential areas. Their efforts have been opposed by animal rights activists who say bears should be free to roam without human interference. This perspective ignored the fact acknowledged by the NJDP, which indicates that bears prefer to live around people. By moving into human areas, the bears are adjusting to a human-centered existence instead of being bears in the woods like they are supposed to be. In 2007, former New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy let a policy permitting bear hunting expire. He exuberantly tweeted that 2020 would be the last bear hunt in the state. Apparently, humans are not the only animals that emigrate. The black bear population in New Jersey has been bolstered in recent years by bears moving into the state from nearby New York and Pennsylvania. Currently, there are estimated to be 3,000 black bears in the state of New Jersey. Given that New Jersey is only 8,722 square miles, that puts their population density at about 1 bear per every 3 square miles. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. With all that food around, why do you think the bears in New Jersey still raid people's trash cans? Do you think Carol would have been mauled by the bear if it weren't for Amanda? Do you think the presence of the dogs exacerbated the incident? Would you want to tangle with an 81-year-old grandma defending her best friend? I am pretty sure I would take a pass on that one. I will enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the scenic and beautiful Trinity Alps, just north of Redding, California. The mountains here are some of the most rugged and remote peaks in the United States. From the bottom of the valley, the climb rises 1 vertical mile, over 2 miles hiked. That's a 50% grade and makes for some very steep climbing, but the view is breathtaking in more ways than one. The granite peaks loom over the valleys, packed with black locust, poplar, cottonwood, aspen, maple, and birch trees. The bushes are almost as diverse as the trees, with elder, rhododendron, willow, and dogwood casting the low canopy of the forest. Along the forest floor, Columbia black-tailed deer and a few elk keep the plants trimmed, while coyotes, cougars, and bobcats keep the prey animals in check. Other denizens include foxes, skunks, raccoons, river otters, and a curious little part-time predator called the ringtail. On Saturday, August 15, 2020, USDA Forest Service employee Ken DeCamp headed up the East Fork Lake Trail to photograph wildflowers. He enjoyed the solitude of this location. Given its ruggedness, few people came to the area. He knew he would essentially have the mountain all to himself and relished that thought. Ken huffed and puffed his way for a few miles up the trail, pausing to take in views as he caught his breath and taking a few nice photos here and there.
At about 10:30 a.m., he crossed the creek just before the East Fork Lake Trail met the lake's shore. He paused in thirst. It was 97 degrees already, and the hike had taken a bit of the spring out of his step. The clear, cool creek danced tantalizingly in the sunlight of the warm day, and beckoned him to quench himself with its refreshing taste. Ken looked around and saw a nice clear spot beneath a willow bush, so he walked over and slipped his backpack straps off his shoulders to near his elbows and swung its weight to the ground, just above the steep decline to the creek bank. He bent over and carefully placed his camera down as well and clambered down the slope to the water for a sip from the creek. He drank the cool water until he felt satiated, then plunged his canteen beneath its surface to fill it for the return trip. As the bubbles from the opening of the canteen ceased, Ken knew he was ready to get back to his task. Ken slowly stood up and put the lid to his canteen back on. As he turned around, he glanced up, and a few short feet up the steep incline from him stood a small and apparently very surprised black bear. As Ken's eyes opened wide in surprise, the young black bear lashed out in a blur with its right paw. Ken tried to duck, but the speed of the swat caught him flush on the forehead just above his left eye socket and sent him spinning through the air back into the creek bed below. The man fell face first on the rocky shore of the creek bed, knocked unconscious and limp, with his head about half submerged in its cool waters. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Ken returned to consciousness and watched as his blood tainted the clear waters of the creek. His head hurt and he couldn't see as well out of his left eye. He slowly struggled to his feet, recalling that he was on blood thinners. He stumbled over to his backpack and retrieved a handkerchief to staunch the bleeding from his forehead. His pharmaceutically altered blood quickly drenched the handkerchief and ran down over his face, dripping onto his clothes and the earth beneath him. Ken's head was spinning from the impact of the bear's swat. He was dizzy now, on top of being dehydrated from the day's heat. His vision was blurry, and he could feel his eyelid had been torn up pretty bad by the bear's claws as it struck his head. As Ken searched for the final pieces of the puzzle of what was the last few minutes, he could see the bear's tracks pressed into the forest soil. He could see where the bear stopped for a second when it swatted him, and then clearly stepped right over his unconscious body as he lay next to the creek. Fortunately for him, the bear was not hungry enough to eat a sweaty man that hot day. Ken clumsily repacked his backpack and picked up his camera before following the bear's tracks back down the trail. Ken knew he had to get back to his truck parked at Buck's Ranch about 2 miles to the north. As he slogged the steep trail, the heat of the day intensified, increasing the misery of his condition. He began to feel nauseous, and his head pounded with pain, both of which are symptoms of a concussion. He started puking and forced down big sips from his canteen, which immediately came back up. He vomited until he could only dry heave. Ken knew he couldn't follow this steep and winding trail safely, so he opted to head straight down the ridge in the direction of his truck. The sweat from his head rolled down into the gashes on his forehead, stinging his wound as the blood continued to trickle from it. For 6 hours he battled the heat and the rugged terrain, but finally emerged on the road, where he rested for about a half an hour. His truck was only a half mile up the road, but Ken had to pause every 25 yards or so to let his pounding head settle a bit. That last half mile took a grueling hour to stumble up the hill on the road to where his truck was parked. Ken knew he had to get to the hospital as soon as he could. He drove for another 2 hours, all the way to Redding, and the waiting arms of the emergency room medical staff there. As Ken walked the short distance from the parking lot into the entrance, he collapsed one last time, exhausted, confused, and near giving up. The staff at the ER cleaned up the wound on his forehead and eyelid, as well as closed it up with a few stitches, then administered pain medicine to dull his aching head. 5 months after the run-in with the small black bear, Ken was mostly recovered. He had to do eye exercises to rehabilitate his vision, as well as wear scleral contacts to help him regain his depth perception damaged during the attack. Ken is quoted as saying, "It all boils down to something my dad told me many years ago. You do what you have to do, no matter what the situation, because you always have to come home." Given that his injuries were nowhere near some of the episodes on this channel, I would say Ken got off pretty lucky. He was lucky the bear wasn't hungry. He was lucky the bear wasn't just a little larger and more powerful. He was lucky the bear wasn't a sow, protecting her little cubs. Ken finished his comments with this: "An experience like this won't keep me from returning to my backcountry adventures, in the Trinity Alps or anywhere else. Life is too short, and there is too much to experience to ever be fearful of something like this happening again. If there's a lesson to be learned, it's this. Always be aware of your surroundings and never take your safety for granted.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This episode is The Camera-Shy Bear That Ate Richard White. Denali National Park lies 240 miles north of Anchorage and features over 4 million acres of pristine wilderness. This is exactly what drew 49-year-old Richard White to the area and fueled his fascination with gathering amazing wildlife photos. Richard had finally put his ultimate vacation plan into action and even took the mandatory bear awareness training and packed his backpack with all the necessary equipment he would need for his trip. Richard traveled to Denali and completed all of his trip paperwork and indicated he had had over 30 years of backpacking experience. Officials were not overly concerned given the info that was provided on his paperwork and issued his 5-day visitor pass. Richard hit the trail by himself and instantly started soaking in the sights and sounds of the wilderness. He was finally alone in the wild and couldn't seem to stop taking pictures of landscapes, moose, bear, salmon, and nearly endless series of breathtaking sky views. It was on day 3 that Richard was hiking along the scenic Toklat River and enjoying the fresh air, clear skies, and the freedom. The August weather was rainy and brisk, but most of all, welcoming. In the distance, Richard noticed a brown lump slowly moving along some willow near the river upstream, about 3 miles south of the road. He approached the animal and determined that he had found a grizzly bear, also known as a brown bear. He had seen many brown bears through his hiking adventures and had never had a problem with any of them. He decided he would get closer and take a good look. His shutter clicked quietly as the bear seemed oblivious of Richard's presence. Richard watched as the bear grazed on greens along the riparian zone near the river. The bear remained ignorant of Richard, so he closed the distance to within about 50 yards. He was capturing amazing photos of the world's fiercest land predator on a very personal level. These shots were going to be great. Dan was hiking the trail through Denali when he and his 2 friends came upon a curious sight. There was someone's backpack lying in the trail. The hikers next saw some torn-up clothing. Moving a little further off the trail, they saw a scene where the grass and bushes were all disturbed, and then they found blood. The group realized this must have been a bear attack and hurried back to the road to find help. After the hikers alerted the park rangers, it took them only about 2.5 hours to get to the scene by helicopter. As they flew over the area, they found a single boar grizzly bear guarding an apparent food cache. They hurriedly set their helicopter down and immediately found Richard's remains, partially consumed by the bear. The bear ran away as the men approached the kill site, but returned to chase the recovery team from its kill. The rangers watched carefully as the bear began to circle them methodically, seemingly looking for a weakness. They decided to back off and try a recovery on another day as the daylight was fading and the bear was exerting his claim to the body. That Saturday they returned and recovered Richard's body and any of his belongings they could find. One of the items they found was Richard's blood-soaked camera. Upon examining the photos in the camera, the rangers discovered amazing photos, one after another. The last several shots were of the bear, and with each shot, the distance between the man and the bear seemed to get shorter and shorter. The final few photos were the most telling. The bear was looking straight at the photographer for the first time in the series, and was photographed closing the distance on the man. Officials shot the bear and completed a necropsy on the Bruin. Examination of the bear's stomach contents proved that this was the bear that killed and ate Richard White.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.